novamusic.com.
Hey everybody, John here from Nova Musik. We're here today to look at the Sub 37 Tribute Edition from our friends at Moog Music. For great deals on the Sub 37 and other Moog products, visit Nova Musik and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Let's start by parsing the name a little bit. Sub 37, first of all, will suggest to those of you familiar with the Moog product line that this synth shares more than a little in common with last year's very popular Sub Phatty 25-key monophonic analog synth. The Bob Moog Tribute Edition is a reference both to the design of this version of the Sub 37 with its aluminum extruded back and wood sides, and also with the Bob Moog Tribute Edition, a portion of the proceeds from sales of this version of the Sub 37 will be donated by Moog Music to Asheville, North Carolina area school music programs. You'll see also right here on the nameplate that Moog calls this instrument a paraphonic analog synthesizer. Why does Moog call this paraphonic? Typically, especially in the modern incarnation of Moog, all of their synths have been monophonic, and they've always described them as such. And if we want to get technical, all of their monophonic synths are also paraphonic, in that paraphonic just refers to whatever voicing you have, whether it's monophonic multiple oscillators, whether it's polyphonic, whatever voicing you have is being fed through the same set of amp and filter envelopes. So there are polyphonic paraphonic synths. This was common especially on old string synthesizers. There are even some classic polyphonic non-string synthesizer analog synths that are technically paraphonic because their multiple voices of polyphony are nevertheless going through the same amp and filter envelopes. In this case, Moog, departing from calling it monophonic, refers to the fact that whereas on other Moog monophonic synths, and as you still can on the Sub 37, you would typically set the interval between its two oscillators once here on the front panel, thusly, and then as you march up and down the keyboard and play different notes, the interval stays the same. And that's how it's always been on the Moog monophonic synths. On the Sub 37, they allow you to engage what's called dual mode. And in this way, you can actually play the interval, where you can hear that that's different from that. And then as you play different parts, make your own intervals at different parts of your performance or different steps in your sequence. So it's just sort of the decoupling of the two oscillators from the single setting on the front panel, letting you play intervals and sort of two-note chords, but still feeding them through the same amp and filter envelopes. Moving along here to the architecture and the front panel and the signal path, it's worth pointing out it's sort of an interesting case of the tail wagging the dog. To hear Moog's designers talk about this synth and the feedback they got about last year's Sub Phatty, while there were no doubt people who asked for very specific features on the Sub Phatty that are here on the Sub 37, such as the arpeggiator or sequencer or some extra modulation options, apparently by far the biggest call or the biggest request for the Sub Phatty was to have more keys. 25 keys aren't enough for certain types of players. So that was the sort of the first feature added, was an extra octave, and hence the name Sub 37. And then, again, sort of the way Moog tells the story is they had this longer keyboard, they had this wider panel, and they said, gee, what else can we do with all this panel real estate? And that's what led to a lot of the features being incorporated. Here at the left, there's we'll start with sort of note and gate generation. There is now an arpeggiator on this synth. It's very capable with all the modes you'd expect, as well as a 16-step step sequencer. The steps can be input 101 style, where you just sort of engage the step sequencer record mode, tap in your 16 steps. There are buttons here for rests and legato ties. In addition to putting in sequences sort of in the SH101 style, you'll also be able to use these 16 preset access buttons here along the bottom to tap in and enter note values XOX style. As we get into the glide section, it's worth pointing out that another thing accomplished with the expanded panel real estate on this synth is to bring a lot of functions that were present on the Sub Phatty but accessible only through somewhat obscure button combinations or accessible only through its software editor, to bring a lot of those features out to the front panel and get at least closer to a one knob and one button per function kind of interface, and have less that's sort of hidden under the surface. And one place where that becomes apparent is here in the glide section, where the Sub Phatty had sort of basic controls for glide on the panel with different glide types available as under the hood feature. Here they're all brought out to the front. You can choose not only different glide types, but whether glide is operating on one or the other or both oscillators, whether you're doing legato or gated mode, and of course the controls for on-off and glide time. As I mentioned earlier, it's a dual oscillator setup with two variable wave shape oscillators, not unlike the Sub Phatty. As I mentioned earlier also, we have the new dual mode, which lets you decouple the second oscillator from the fixed interval or fixed frequency that you would typically find on Moog's multi-oscillator synths. One of the other functions that was brought out from under the hood on the Sub Phatty that is now accessible right here from the front panel is oscillator beat frequency, where you can control sort of the oscillator start points and control how they operate or beat together. In addition, in the voicing, we have a square wave sub oscillator, an analog noise source, and here, this is kind of interesting too, Moog synths often have an external in. This one does as well, and this control here on the mixer can control the level of the external in. However, if you're not using the external in, it becomes what they call a feedback control, which mimics the old Mini Moog Model D trick of taking the output and running it back through the external sound input. So you can do that now with just a button press without having to actually run cables, or again, you can use it in the traditional external input fashion. Next up, we have the expected Moog 24 dB ladder filter with a twist. On the Sub 37, you can control the filter slope, or the sort of the number of poles. Also here in the filter section, the Sub 37 inherits the very popular and distinctive multi-drive from the Sub Phatty, which is a sort of extra drive that's wrapped around the filter and gave the Sub Phatty a lot of its distinctive sound. Moving over now to the filter and amp envelope section, we're going to find some more bells and whistles and enhancements that weren't present on the Sub Phatty. One being that both of these envelopes can be latched on, which is handy particularly for when you're running sounds to the external input in terms of not having to hold down or tape down keys. It's also an interesting feature in that both of these envelopes can be looped. If they're latched on or if you're holding down keys, you can have these envelopes continuously re-trigger. They can re-trigger if the envelopes aren't the same length, sort of out of sync with one another, which makes for some very interesting sounds. And both envelopes, when they are being looped, can also be sunk to external clock in, to the arpeggiator, to whatever sync source you might have going at the time. Also, because the Sub 37 inherits its software envelopes from the Sub Phatty, they were able to add a couple of extra stages to the amp envelope. If I'm getting this right in terms of the order of these, it could be described as instead of just your typical ADSR envelope, it is a DAHDSR, if I have that right, in that ahead of the attack there's a delay, and then between the attack and the decay there's a hold. And here on the panel is sort of one of the only places where you get away from true knob for function, in that engaging this switch here lets you control the delay and the hold, velocity and keyboard tracking using these same four knobs. Here we find there are now two modulation buses with sawtooth and square and ramp and sample and hold, all right here and selectable on the front panel, as well as at the end here sort of a catch-all programmable modulation source, which we'll be able to use to select or route other modulation options. Both of these mod buses can again be sunk to incoming MIDI clock, to the arpeggiator. And we find here also that in addition to pitch and filter destinations for both, there's sort of an assignable. There are 5 options right here on the front panel where it can also be assigned to oscillator 1, oscillator 2, or both wave shapes, to the amplifier level, the noise level. You can use one LFO to modulate the rate of the other LFO in both directions. And here again, there's sort of a programmable catch-all destination which will be used to choose other options that aren't right here on the front panel. It's worth pointing out here too that several of the controls, especially here in the modulation section, but also on other parts of the panel for the filter envelope amount or for the second oscillator frequency, are now bipolar. It's actually taken a bit of getting used to as we've been playing with the Sub 37, in that you're used to a lot of these controls going from 0 or all the way closed at the left to maximum or all the way open at the right, whereas now 0's at the center and you can sweep them both into negative or positive territory. Here we have also 16 preset buttons, and each of these 16 buttons can also be used to select a bank. So you have 16 by 16, or a total of 256 preset locations available, quite a bit more than what you had on the Sub Phatty. Speaking of presets, the Sub 37, like the Sub Phatty, will have a software editor which will let you manage your preset library in case 256 isn't enough locations for you, and shuffle them in and out. Even though it has been a great effort, as we mentioned, to bring a lot of what were previously under the hood features on the Sub Phatty out to the panel here, there are still some things we know about right off the bat that will still be under the hood and accessible through the editor, and that also gives Moog a lot of leeway to add more potentially that's only accessible from the editor. Besides the software patch editing and patch management functions that they will offer, Moog has also said that there will be a piece of software to let you run the Sub 37 as a plugin in your DAW. So via presumably VSTs or audio unit formats, you'll be able to host the Sub 37 in your plugin input host and run it as though it were a software instrument. Here on the left panel of the instrument, we find the expected complement of inputs and outputs, audio out and external audio in, as well as CV inputs for the pitch, filter, and volume, and a gate input. Also here on the left, we find MIDI in and out jacks, as well as a USB connection. Something we mentioned earlier in going through the filter and amp envelope section is that one of the new features on the Sub 37 is that both envelopes can not only be latched and held on, but also looped, so that you can have envelopes of not only completely different designs, but different lengths, looping at different speeds, which in addition to the syncable modulation buses, things you can have going on with the arpeggiator, gives you some interesting options for polyrhythmic, multi-rhythmic sounds that you can get going by looping these two envelopes. And we thought we'd demonstrate that a little bit right now. Something we didn't mention before when we were talking about dual mode, or the paraphonic capabilities of this synth, the ability to decouple and play intervals on the second oscillator, is that with this switch here, you can switch off keyboard control of the second oscillator completely, have it run only from the frequency knob here, Moog, I think, informally calls this drone mode, and you can sort of hear what that sounds like here if we latch it on and then play some other notes along with the drone. So I've got this set pretty much center here, and we'll just start it up like this. So that's the Sub 37. And just to sort of wrap things up, on one hand, given its provenance and its name, this is a Sub Phatty with an extra octave of keys. This is a Sub Phatty with a bunch of extra preset locations, but it would be a huge mistake to stop there and pigeonhole it as being just those things. As we've mentioned a few times, there's been a huge effort by Moog's engineers to bring previously under the hood features out onto the panel, and even beyond that, there are a lot of bells and whistles and new enhancements and features that are completely unique to this synth. You get a lot for your money. It's well worth checking out, not only for its great sound, but again, for all these new functions and features that are making their debut on the Sub 37. Here at Nova Musik, we have a long history and a great relationship with Moog, so by all means, hit us up with any questions you have, check us out for great deals, and thanks for watching.
novamusic.com.